Disease Control in the United States has reported that every 11 minutes, one person dies by suicide. The World Health Organization states that every year, over 700,000 people die by suicide. To mark this day and the sobering statistics that comes around it, we've invited Dr. Gerard Hutchinson. Dr. Hutchinson would introduce himself, and we're then going to get into today's interview. Dr. Hutchinson?
Yeah, hi, good morning, Tanya. Thanks for the invitation. So my name is Gerard Hutchinson. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of the West Indies, and the subject area of suicide has always fascinated me. And I have done some amount of work, certainly as it pertains to suicide in Trinidad and Tobago. And this work highlights some of the issues that surround the issue of suicide and suicidal behavior in Trinidad and Tobago, and to a lesser extent the Caribbean region. So I'd be happy to talk about these things, as today is World Suicide Prevention Day.
We're very, very grateful to have you on to mark this event, Dr. Hutchinson. And I know that you prefer to be called Gerard, so we'd honor that right here. I would like for us to just take 60 seconds to, just reflect on life and particularly for those that we've lost, those that we would never get to know, leaders we'd never get to hear from. Just 60 seconds of silence to mark their lives and to pay our respects. I'm going to put the timer on. It is now 6:23. At 6:24 we begin. Thank you. I could not have prepared for today's interview without the help of NALIS, Port of Spain. That's the public library located in Trinidad and Tobago. Miss Venice Phillip went above and beyond to ensure I had every single document possible that Dr. Hutchinson or Gerard has written as well as with his colleagues. Gerard, you've been researching suicide, I think, for approximately 30 years now. And, I understand that, Freud, who's another prominent, researcher and psychiatrist, suggested that suicide has to do with anger being internalized and that it was meant for someone else. More recently, Thomas Joyner of 2005 proposed an interpersonal theory of suicide, which suggests that it's a desire that is born out of one feeling as though they're a burden and that they don't belong. Just to explore this, what is Gerard's theory of suicide?
Well, I mean, I don't know that there can be one single unifying theory. I think people engage in that activity for a variety of reasons, or can do so for a variety of reasons. I think the other difficult thing is that because when people die by suicide, we have no opportunity to ask them why they've done it, it means that the work that is done is really more deductive, exploratory work, looking backwards. The procedure is called a psychological autopsy, but that depends on information from relatives, perhaps things that the person might have left behind, suicide notes, or other references to their desire to end their lives. So we're really trying to peek into their minds to find out why they would have done it. Clearly, mental health or problems with mental health are one of the prime drivers, and particularly mental health conditions where hopelessness is a feature. So the presence of hopelessness, for whatever reason, I think is probably the final common pathway. Why people feel hopeless to the extent that they want to end their lives, I think is still something that has to be figured out. I think there are other things that are associated with it. Alcohol use, for example, I guess, again, thought to be a means of disinhibition. Um, and the different kinds of suicide as well. For example, the suicide bombers, um, whose motives are political or religious, perhaps. So I don't know that there's any overarching theory, but that I think we have to consider it as a kind of multifaceted to have a multifaceted etiology.
Thank you. What is the difference between self-harm and suicide? Would could you clarify that for us, please?
Well, in some ways, it's semantic in the sense that suicide is a kind of self-harm and that you're doing something to harm yourself. Um, but self-harm is a kind of global description of any behavior that results in self-harm. So this may be deliberate, like in people who cut or people who burn themselves. It might be less so in people who harm themselves accidentally. For example, farmers who accidentally ingest pesticides or weedicides. So it's a kind of self-harm describes the act of engaging in behavior that results in some kind of damage to self. Suicide, of course, is in a sense the ultimate self-harm in the way that the person who wants to die or wants to harm themselves to the point where they die would engage in behavior that would likely result in their death. So you find that the people who die by suicide would have used more drastic or more serious methods of self-harm, and that those would have ultimately resulted in their death.
I understand. Does that then mean that people who use self-harm without really wanting to commit suicide, that they could perhaps end up taking their own lives?
Sure, sure. And again, so this is what makes the whole study of suicide interesting on one hand, or fascinating, but also perhaps ultimately inscrutable, because there are people who might not have intended to die, but because of the method they chose or because of misperception of the lethality of the method they chose, they end up dying, but it was not their intent. By definition, suicide, of course, requires one, that the act is by your own hand, so it would meet that criteria, but also that there is some intent to die. And if there's no intent to die, is it really suicide or is this accidental death? But if it's by your own hand, it's still labeled as suicide. The other interesting thing is that suicide ultimately, certainly in the Western world, is a legal definition. So the law defines what suicide is. And in most jurisdictions in the West, a coroner, after somebody dies by their own hand, a coroner has to adjudicate on whether in fact it was suicide. It doesn't happen as commonly now, and most uh, statistical measures that are done countrywide, in our case in Trinidad and Tobago, the Central Statistical Office, they use death certificates as their means of determining the numbers. Again, that might not be always accurate because suicide, again, in Trinidad and Tobago, and I think the rest of the Caribbean, is against the law. People might not want, and they might persuade the people filling out the death certificates to not put suicide as the cause of death. So even statistically identifying the number of people there who have died by suicide, there are concerns and difficulties.
You highlighted a very important point, well, several important points. One of which the criminality of suicide. Would that be an accurate way of saying it? That it's
Well, I guess because it's against the law, you could label it as a criminal offense. I'm not sure I would like to associate the word criminality with it. Um, but it is against the law, and I'm not sure about the origins of that in terms of the West. I guess in post-colonial societies would have originated in the colonial headquarters in Europe, but most countries in Europe have now gone past that. But unfortunately, many of their colonies or former colonies continue to have those laws on their books. So so it is deemed against the law.
well, with regard to colonies, may the Queen's soul rest in peace, and hopefully we would be able to see some changes in these laws as it affects people's, you know.
Well, I think it applies again, and I guess it's part of the post-colonial situation. Many laws that are on the books in former colonies in the Commonwealth, looking at those that were under the jurisdiction of England, have laws that the English would have dispensed with many years ago, but because, in a sense, they were inherited, they have not been looked at. But it is something that requires attention.
Duly noted. One of the things I discovered in your interviews, your research, you have a sociological theme, and you're urging the authorities and all of us to pay particular attention to the most vulnerable